For many across India, the word Swaraj, or self-rule, evoked grand ideas of political independence and a nation free from British control. It was a concept debated in legislative halls and proclaimed in city squares by leaders of the growing nationalist movement. However, for the thousands of plantation workers toiling in the tea gardens of Assam, Swaraj held a much more immediate and deeply personal meaning. It was not an abstract political goal, but a tangible, desperate yearning for basic human dignity. To them, Swaraj was the simple, profound right to move freely, to leave the oppressive confines of the tea estates, and to finally return to the homes and villages they had been forced to leave behind years ago. Their lives were governed by a cruel piece of legislation known as the Inland Emigration Act of 1859. This law was designed to ensure a constant, cheap and captive labor force for the immensely profitable tea industry. Under this act, workers were effectively imprisoned within the plantations. They were not permitted to leave the tea gardens without official permission, a consent that was almost never granted by the British planters. This system trapped them in a cycle of hard labor and isolation, cutting them off from their ancestral lands, their families and their cultural roots. The sprawling green tea fields, so picturesque to outsiders, were for them a vast open-air prison from which there was no easy escape. The dream of returning home became the central pillar of their idea of freedom. They remembered the villages they came from, in places like Bihar, Orissa, and the central provinces, not just as geographical locations, but as symbols of a life where they were not bonded laborers. They longed for the familiarity of their own communities, the comfort of their own languages, and the possibility of tilling their own small plots of land. Every rumor that trickled into the plantations about the growing freedom struggle across India was filtered through this lens of personal liberation. Their Swaraj was a dream of walking out of the plantation gates and never looking back, a journey back to a life of autonomy and belonging. The desire to break free from this bondage was a constant simmering undercurrent in the tea gardens. The workers faced grueling hours, meager wages, and harsh living conditions, all enforced by the authority of the planters and the legal framework of the British Raj. Their existence was one of relentless exploitation, where their labor enriched distant owners while they remained impoverished and disenfranchised. The simple act of visiting a neighboring village, let alone traveling hundreds of miles back to their native homes, was an impossibility. This profound lack of freedom defined their existence and shaped their unique and powerful interpretation of what an independent India should mean for them. It was a dream not of ruling, but of returning. The winds of change began to blow through the isolated tea gardens with the launch of the non-cooperation movement in 1920. News of Mahatma Gandhi and his powerful message of resistance and self-reliance spread like wildfire, even reaching the remote corners of Assam. For the plantation workers, Gandhi was more than just a political leader. He became a messianic figure, a harbinger of a new age. They heard his name chanted in the nearby towns and learned of his promise to end the injustices of British rule. This message resonated deeply with their own suffering, and they began to believe that the era of Gandhi Raj was dawning, an era that would finally bring an end to their troubles. Inspired by this powerful wave of nationalism, the workers began to see their own struggle as part of this larger fight for India's soul. The call for non-cooperation was interpreted in the most direct way imaginable. They would refuse to cooperate with their oppressors, the British planters. In their minds, Gandhi Raj meant that media group, British colonial officials walking in tea gardens, empty colonial office chairs, British flag being lowered at distribute equally. The British would have no more power. The oppressive contracts would be void, and the hated Inland Emigration Act would cease to exist. They believed that under Gandhi's new rule, they would not only be free to leave, but would also be given land in their home villages, allowing them to rebuild the lives that had been stolen from them. This belief sparked one of the most moving episodes of the freedom struggle in the region. In May 1921, thousands of workers made a momentous decision. Acting on their faith in Gandhi and the promise of Swaraj, they defied the plantation authorities and began a mass exodus. They gathered their meager belongings, abandoned the tea fields that had been their prisons, and started the long and arduous journey home. Chanting Gandhi Maharaj Ki Jai, or victory to the great King Gandhi, they turned their backs on a life of servitude. This was their non-cooperation. This was their declaration of independence, a powerful and spontaneous act of self-liberation fueled by hope. Their understanding of Swaraj was not something learned from a Congress manifesto or a political speech. It was an organic interpretation, born from their lived experience of injustice. They envisioned a time when all their suffering would end, a kind of golden age where fairness and freedom prevailed. The journey home was therefore both a physical and a spiritual one. It was a pilgrimage towards a promised land, an India where they would no longer be treated as less than human. Their hopeful march out of the plantations was a testament to the profound power of the idea of freedom, an idea that had given them the courage to challenge a system designed to crush their spirits. The hopeful exodus of the Assam plantation workers, however, was destined to meet a tragic and violent end. Their path to freedom was fraught with immense challenges from the very beginning. The journey from the remote tea gardens to their distant home villages required them to travel by railway and steamer, but their plans were soon thwarted. As they reached the transport hubs, they found themselves stranded. A strike by railway and steamer workers, itself a part of the non-cooperation movement, had brought all transport to a grinding halt. The very movement that had inspired their flight now inadvertently became an obstacle in their path, leaving them trapped and vulnerable. Stranded at the transit points, such as the river port of Chandpur, the workers' situation grew desperate. They had little food, no shelter, and no means to continue their journey forward or to retreat. Their dream of reaching home was rapidly turning into a nightmare. It was in this vulnerable state that the full force of the colonial state was unleashed upon them. The British authorities, alarmed by this mass defiance, ordered the police to intervene. Instead of providing aid to the stranded families, the police were instructed to force them back to the plantations. The planters and the government viewed their departure not as a quest for freedom, but as a breach of contract and a threat to their economic interests. What followed was an act of shocking brutality. The police, under the command of British officials, attacked the defenseless and exhausted workers. Men, women, and children were mercilessly beaten with lathis and rifle butts. The very people who had dreamed of a new era of justice under Gandhi Raj were met with the old, familiar violence of the British Raj. Their peaceful and hopeful procession was crushed with brute force, their chants for freedom silenced by the cries of pain. The dream of Swaraj, which had seemed so close just days before, was shattered on the banks of the river, their hopes drowning in a sea of official cruelty and indifference. Although their attempt to reach home failed, the workers' struggle was not in vain. Their vision of Swaraj was indeed different from the more constitutional and political goals articulated by many Congress leaders. Theirs was a gut-level emotional demand for the end of personal suffering and the restoration of basic rights. Yet, by chanting Gandhi's name and raising slogans for a Swatantra Bharat or independent India, they instinctively connected their local fight to the broader all-India agitation. They saw their personal liberation as inseparable from the nation's liberation, emotionally identifying with a cause that was much larger than their immediate circumstances. And in doing so, they enriched the very meaning of the freedom struggle. While the plantation workers in Assam were facing their own brutal reality, the national movement was approaching a critical turning point. The non-cooperation movement had mobilized millions across the country, uniting diverse groups under the common banner of Swaraj. However, Mahatma Gandhi was steadfast in his principle of non-violence, or ahimsa. He believed that true Swaraj could only be achieved through peaceful means, and that the people, the satyagrahis, needed to be thoroughly trained in discipline and self-control. He felt that the movement was beginning to stray from this path, with incidents of violence erupting in various places, which deeply troubled him. The decisive moment came in February 1922 with the Chauri Chaura incident in Gorakhpur district, Uttar Pradesh. There, a peaceful demonstration of protesters was fired upon by the local police. In retaliation, the enraged crowd attacked and set fire to the police station, resulting in the deaths of 22 policemen. For Gandhi, this event was a profound moral failure. He believed it signaled that the movement had lost its non-violent character and that the people were not yet ready for a mass struggle of this scale. Feeling that the movement was spiraling into a cycle of violence and reprisal, he made the unilateral and controversial decision to call off the non-cooperation movement entirely. The abrupt withdrawal of the movement sent shockwaves across the nation and led to a period of disillusionment and debate within the Indian National Congress. Many leaders were stunned by the decision, feeling that it was a mistake to halt the struggle when it was at its peak. This disagreement over strategy led to a split within the Congress. A faction of leaders, including C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru, grew weary of mass agitation. They argued for a change in tactics, advocating for participation in the provincial council elections that had been set up by the Government of India Act of 1919. This led to the formation of the Swaraj Party within the Congress. Their goal was to enter the British-controlled legislative councils not to cooperate, but to obstruct the government from within, a strategy they called council entry. They aimed to wreck the system from the inside and expose its undemocratic nature. In contrast, another group of leaders, which included younger and more radical figures like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose, remained convinced that freedom could only be won through continued mass struggle. They pushed for more radical agitation and pressed for the ultimate goal of Purna Swaraj, or complete independence, setting the stage for the next, more intense phase of India's long walk to freedom.